The humid Philippine night clung to Commodore George Dewey like a shroud as he stood on the bridge of his flagship, the USS Olympia, peering through the darkness toward Manila Bay. It was the early hours of May 1st, 1898, and the fate of two empires hung in the balance. The Spanish-American War had erupted just weeks earlier. Now Dewey found himself 7,000 miles from home, preparing to strike at the heart of Spain's Pacific Empire. "Signal the fleet," Dewey commanded, his voice cutting through the tropical air. "You may fire when ready, Gridley." But that famous order would not come for hours yet. First, his squadron had to navigate the treacherous entrance to Manila Bay under cover of darkness, slipping past the fortified islands that guarded the harbor like stone sentinels. The American fleet consisted of 4 cruisers and 2 gunboats. The Olympia, Boston, Raleigh, Baltimore, Concord, and Petrel. Together, it carried 53 guns and nearly 1,700 men into battle against Admiral Patricio Montoyo's Spanish squadron. The Spanish forces, though numerically inferior with only 7 vessels, held the advantage of fighting. In home waters, with shore batteries to support them, as the first hints of dawn began to streak the eastern sky, Dewey's ships emerged from the night like ghosts materializing from the mist. The Spanish fleet lay anchored in a defensive line off Cavite, their black holes silhouetted against the growing light. Admiral Montoyo had positioned his ships carefully, hoping to draw the Americans within range of the Cavite arsenal's guns. While protecting his vessels in shallow water, the tension aboard the American ships was palpable. Sailors checked their weapons one final time, while officers studied the enemy positions through their telescopes. Many of these men had never seen combat, yet they were about to participate in what would become one of the most decisive naval victories in American history. At 5:41 that morning, the Spanish batteries at Sangley Point opened fire, their shells screaming across the water toward the approaching American squadron. The battle for Manila Bay had begun, and with it, America's emergence as a global naval power. The first shots fell short, sending up towering waterspouts that drenched the forward decks of the American ships. Dewey remained calm, studying the Spanish positions as his fleet closed the distance. He had spent months preparing for this moment, gathering intelligence about Spanish defenses and training his crews to a razor's edge. Now, as the enemy shells began to find their range, he knew that the next few hours would determine not just the fate of the Philippines, but America's role in the Pacific for generations to come. The Commodore's plan was audacious in its simplicity. It's close with the enemy fleet and destroy it through superior firepower and seamanship. There would be no complex maneuvers, no elaborate tactical schemes. Just American steel and gunpowder against Spanish pride and desperation. As the sun climbed higher over Manila Bay, both fleets prepared for a clash that would echo through the annals of naval warfare. At precisely 5:53 in the morning, Commodore Dewey gave the order that would resonate through American naval history, standing calmly on the bridge of the Olympia as Spanish shells whistled overhead. He turned to Captain Charles Gridley and spoke the words that would become legend. "You may fire when ready, Gridley." The American squadron had closed to 5,500 yards of the Spanish line, well within effective range of their modern 8-inch and 6-inch guns. The Olympia's forward turret erupted in flame and smoke, sending the first American shell screaming toward Admiral Montoyo's flagship, the Reina Cristina. Within moments, all 4 American cruisers had joined the bombardment, their guns firing in carefully timed salvos that turned the peaceful morning air into a hellish cacophony of explosions. The Spanish response was immediate, but less coordinated. Their older vessels, many dating from the 1870s and 80s, carried lighter guns with shorter ranges. The Reina Cristina, Don Antonio de Ulloa, and Castilla returned fire gamely, their crews displaying the courage that had made Spanish sailors legendary throughout the centuries. Shore batteries at Cavite and Sangley Point added their voices to the chorus, sending shells arcing high over the water toward the American line. According to historical accounts preserved in the Naval War College archives, the accuracy of American gunnery proved devastating from the opening moments. The Olympia's gun crews, trained to perfection during long months at sea, found their targets with deadly precision. Shell after shell crashed into Spanish hulls, setting fires and dismounting guns with each hit. Dewey employed a tactic that showcased both his tactical brilliance and his confidence in American seamanship. Rather than maintaining a static battle line, he ordered his squadron to steam back and forth in front of the Spanish fleet in a series of parallel runs. This maneuver, executed 5 times over the course of the battle, allowed his ships to bring their full broadsides to bear, while making them more difficult targets for the Spanish gunners. The Spanish squadron fought with desperate valor, but they were overmatched from the start. The Reina Cristina, attempting to ram the Olympia in a final desperate charge, took concentrated fire from multiple American ships. Her superstructure was shot away, her engines disabled, and fires raged throughout her hull.
Admiral Montoya,
wounded by shrapnel, was forced to transfer his flag to the Isla de Cuba as his flagship limped back towards shallow water. By 7:35 that morning, after nearly 2 hours of continuous bombardment, Dewey made an unexpected decision that would add to his legend. Concerned about ammunition expenditure and wanting to ensure his crews had breakfast, he signaled a ceasefire and withdrew his squadron to count shells and assess damage. The temporary lull allowed the Spanish to tend their wounded and fight fires, but it could not change the inevitable outcome. During this brief respite, Dewey discovered that his fears about ammunition were unfounded. His ships had expended only a fraction of their shells, and damage to the American squadron was remarkably light. A few hits had been scored by Spanish guns, but no American vessel was seriously damaged. The contrast with the Spanish fleet could not have been more stark. Several of their ships were burning wrecks. The rest showed signs of severe punishment. The Commodore's decision to resume the battle was never in doubt. At 11:16 that morning, the American squadron steamed back toward the Spanish line, ready to complete the destruction they had begun at dawn. When Commodore Dewey's squadron resumed its attack at 11:16 that morning, the Spanish resistance had already begun to crumble. The 2-hour respite had done little to restore Spanish fighting capability. Admiral Montoya's fleet, battered and burning from the morning's bombardment, faced the grim reality that they were fighting not just for victory, but for survival. The American guns opened fire again with methodical precision. The Olympia led the attack, her 8-inch rifles sending shells crashing into the already damaged Spanish vessels with devastating effect. The Don Juan de Austria, which had fought gallantly through the morning, now found herself taking concentrated fire from multiple American ships. Her return fire grew sporadic as gun after gun was knocked out of action. The most dramatic moment of the renewed battle came when the Spanish gunboat Ulloa, her captain refusing to surrender despite hopeless odds, continued firing her single 4.7-inch gun even as flames consumed her superstructure. The small vessel's defiant stand epitomized the courage of Spanish sailors. But courage alone could not overcome the overwhelming firepower advantage held by Dewey's modern squadron Captain Gridley of the Olympia, observing the gallant resistance of the Spanish gunboat, reportedly remarked to his gun crews, "That's the kind of fighting spirit that built the Spanish Empire." Yet admiration did not stay American hands. The Ulloa was soon reduced to a burning hulk, her brave crew forced to abandon ship or perish in the flames. As detailed in reports later filed with the Navy Department in Washington, the Spanish shore batteries at Cavite had also ceased effective resistance by early afternoon. American shells had systematically destroyed the gun emplacements, turning the fortress into a smoking ruin. The few Spanish guns still capable of firing could no longer find the range to threaten Dewey's ships, which maintained their deadly carousel pattern offshore. By 12:30 that afternoon, the Battle of Manila Bay was effectively over. Spanish fleet had been completely destroyed as a fighting force. The Reina Cristina lay beached and burning. The Castilla had been shot to pieces and sunk in shallow water. The Don Antonio de Ulloa had been destroyed by concentrated American fire. Of the 7 Spanish vessels that had started the battle, not one remained capable of offering meaningful resistance. Admiral Montoya, wounded and with his flagship destroyed, faced the bitter necessity of surrender. From his temporary headquarters in the Cavite arsenal, he sent a white flag across the bay. The Spanish Empire's presence in the Pacific, built over 3 centuries of exploration and conquest, had been effectively ended in less than 7 hours. Of combat, the human cost of Spain's defeat was staggering compared to American losses. Spanish casualties numbered in the hundreds, with dozens of sailors killed outright and many more wounded by American shell fire. Ships' companies that had begun the day with proud traditions, stretching back to the conquistadors, now found themselves swimming for shore or clinging to wreckage in Manila Bay. In stark contrast, American casualties were almost impossibly light. Not a single man in Dewey's squadron had been killed, and only a handful suffered minor wounds from shell fragments. The Baltimore had taken one hit that caused minimal damage, while the other ships emerged virtually unscathed. It was a victory so complete and one-sided that it seemed almost unreal to those who witnessed it. The aftermath of the Battle of Manila Bay revealed the true magnitude of Dewey's victory. White flags appeared over the remnants of the Spanish fleet and shore batteries. The American Commodore faced a situation unprecedented in his naval career. He had not merely won a battle, he had eliminated an entire enemy fleet while suffering virtually no losses of his own, standing on the bridge of the Olympia. As the smoke cleared over Manila Bay, Dewey surveyed the scene with the calm professionalism that had marked his entire career. Burning Spanish ships dotted the harbor, their hulks serving as monuments to the swiftness and completeness of American victory. The Cavite Arsenal, once a symbol of Spanish power in the Pacific, lay in ruins, its guns silenced forever. The Commodore's first concern was for the wounded, both American and Spanish. Despite the overwhelming nature of his victory, Dewey immediately ordered medical assistance for Spanish survivors. American naval surgeons, working alongside their few wounded comrades, treated Spanish sailors with the same care they would have shown their own men. This gesture of humanity and victory would be remembered long after the smoke of battle had cleared. Word of the victory spread rapidly through the American squadron. Sailors who had expected a hard-fought battle found themselves celebrating what would be hailed as one of the most complete naval victories in history. On the gun decks of the Baltimore, Boston, Raleigh, Concord, and Petrel, cheers echoed across the water as crews realized the magnitude of their achievement. The Spanish surrender came in stages. Throughout the afternoon of May 1st, Admiral Montoyo, his own flagship destroyed and his squadron annihilated, had no choice but to acknowledge defeat. From the Cavite Arsenal, Spanish officers emerged under flags of truce to negotiate the terms of surrender. The proud Spanish naval tradition in the Pacific, dating back to Magellan's voyage in 1521, had come to an abrupt and decisive end, as reported in subsequent dispatches to Washington. Dewey's handling of victory proved as masterful as his conduct of battle, rather than seeking harsh terms or demanding humiliating concessions. The Commodore accepted the Spanish surrender with dignity and restraint. His primary concern was establishing control over Manila Bay and preventing any further Spanish resistance. Goals he achieved without unnecessary bloodshed. The strategic implications of the victory came clear within hours of the battle's end. With the Spanish fleet destroyed, the entire Philippine archipelago lay open to American occupation. The Spanish garrison in Manila, cut off from reinforcement or resupply, could offer only token resistance to American forces. Dewey had not merely won a naval battle. He had conquered an empire. That evening, as the tropical sun set over Manila Bay, Commodore Dewey composed his historic dispatch to the Navy Department. His message, transmitted via the cable station at Hong Kong, would electrify the American public and establish his place among the nation's greatest naval heroes. "The squadron under my command has destroyed the Spanish fleet," he reported with characteristic understatement. "Control of Manila Bay is now complete." The Battle of Manila Bay had lasted 7 hours from first shot to final surrender. Brief span. The United States had announced its arrival as a Pacific naval power and begun its transformation into a global empire. The Spanish Empire, which had once claimed dominion over much of the world's oceans, had suffered a defeat so complete that recovery was impossible. The sun had barely set over Manila Bay when the full implications of Dewey's victory began to reverberate across the Pacific and beyond. The destruction of the Spanish fleet had created a power vacuum that would reshape the balance of nations from the Philippines to the shores of California. As night fell on May 1, 1898, the age of American naval dominance in the Pacific had begun. In the immediate aftermath of battle, Commodore Dewey faced challenges that went far beyond military victory. With the Spanish fleet eliminated, he found himself responsible for governing Manila Bay and its surrounding territories with no clear instructions from Washington. The American government had anticipated a longer campaign, expecting months of naval operations before achieving decisive results. Instead, Dewey's swift victory had presented them with an instant empire. The Commodore's first priority was establishing effective control over his new domain. Spanish shore installations were occupied by American Marines, while the Cavite arsenal was secured to prevent any sabotage of its valuable facilities. The speed and completeness of Spanish collapse meant that vast quantities of military supplies, including artillery pieces and ammunition, fell into American hands virtually intact. Filipino revolutionaries, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, had been fighting Spanish rule for years before the American arrival. News of Dewey's victory electrified the independence movement, which saw the destruction of Spanish naval power as their opportunity for freedom. However, the relationship between American forces and Filipino rebels would prove complex, eventually leading to years of conflict as American imperial ambitions clashed with Filipino desires for independence, according to historical records maintained by the War Department. The Battle of Manila Bay's strategic consequences extended far beyond the Philippines themselves. Japanese naval observers, already concerned about American expansion in the Pacific, studied reports of the battle with growing alarm. The ease with which modern American warships had destroyed a European fleet suggested that the balance of power in the Pacific was shifting dramatically. European reactions, to Dewey's victory were mixed, but universally recognized its significance. German naval squadrons in the Pacific were reinforced, while British authorities in Hong Kong and Singapore reassessed their own defensive preparations. The destruction of Spanish sea power had removed a familiar opponent, but had replaced it with a potentially far more formidable American presence back in the United States. News of the victory triggered unprecedented celebrations. When Dewey's dispatch reached Washington on May 2nd, it sparked nationwide rejoicing that continued for weeks. The Commodore became an instant national hero, his name appearing in headlines from coast to coast. Songs were written about the Battle of Manila Bay, while children played games reenacting the destruction of the Spanish fleet. President William McKinley, who had authorized Dewey's expedition with some trepidation, now found himself managing the unexpected consequences of total victory. The president had hoped for American success in the Philippines, but the complete elimination of Spanish resistance created new diplomatic and military challenges. Suddenly, the United States needed to decide whether to occupy the Philippines permanently or return them to Spanish control. The economic implications of controlling Manila Bay were not lost on American business leaders. The Philippines represented a potential gateway to the vast Chinese market, while the islands themselves offered opportunities for investment and development. Within weeks of Dewey's victory, American businessmen were making plans for Pacific expansion that would have been impossible under Spanish rule. Spanish authorities in Madrid, reeling from news of their fleet's destruction, began reassessing their entire position in the Pacific. The loss of naval supremacy made it impossible to defend their remaining Pacific territories effectively. The Spanish Empire, which had dominated the Pacific for over 3 centuries, now faced the prospect of complete withdrawal from the region. The weeks following the Battle of Manila Bay transformed Commodore George Dewey from a relatively unknown naval officer into one of America's greatest heroes. As news of his complete victory spread across the United States, the nation erupted in celebrations that had not been seen since the end of the Civil War. From the bustling streets of New York to the frontier towns of California, Americans celebrated. Their navies triumphed with parades, fireworks, and impromptu rallies. Congress moved swiftly to honor the hero of Manila Bay. Within days of receiving official confirmation of the victory, lawmakers authorized Dewey's promotion to the newly created rank of Admiral of the Navy, making him the only person ever to hold that title. The promotion came with a congressional medal and a substantial financial reward. recognition of services that had elevated American prestige throughout the world, the strategic implications of Dewey's victory became clearer as international reactions poured in from European capitals. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, already suspicious of American intentions in the Pacific, ordered additional warships to Philippine waters under the pretext of protecting German commercial interests. This German intervention would create diplomatic tensions that persisted long after the Spanish-American War's conclusion. British reactions proved more favorable to American success. The Royal Navy, which had long dominated global sea lanes, recognized that American naval power could serve British interests by checking German and Russian expansion in the Pacific. British naval authorities in Hong Kong provided crucial support to Dewey's squadron in the months following the battle, establishing a pattern of Anglo-American cooperation that would prove decisive in future conflicts, as documented in Navy Department archives. The technological lessons of Manila Bay revolutionized naval thinking worldwide. Dewey's victory demonstrated the overwhelming superiority of modern steel warships, armed with high-velocity guns over the older vessels that had dominated naval warfare for decades. Naval architects across Europe and Asia began designing new classes of warships based on American innovations demonstrated in the battle. The human cost of Spanish defeat became clear as casualty reports reached Madrid. Over 300 Spanish sailors had been killed or wounded in the battle, while entire ship companies had been captured or forced to abandon their vessels. The psychological impact on Spanish morale was even greater than the material losses, as news of the fleet's destruction convinced many Spaniards that resistance to American forces was hopeless. Filipino reactions to American victory proved complex and would have lasting consequences for both nations. While many Filipinos initially welcomed American forces as liberators from Spanish rule, it quickly became apparent that the United States intended to replace Spanish colonialism with American administration. This realization would lead to the Philippine-American War, a brutal conflict that lasted from 1899 to 1902. Admiral Dewey's management of victory proved as skillful as his conduct of battle. Rather than pursuing glory or political advantage, he focused on establishing stable American administration in the Philippines. While maintaining good relations with Filipino leaders, his diplomatic skills helped prevent immediate conflict between American forces and Filipino revolutionaries. Though tensions continued to build throughout 1898, the Battle of Manila Bay marked a turning point not just in the Spanish-American War, but in the broader history of American foreign policy. Before Dewey's victory, the United States had been primarily concerned with continental expansion and hemispheric defense. The acquisition of the Philippines forced Americans to think globally for the first time, considering their nation's role. In Asian politics and Pacific commerce, European observers recognized that Manila Bay represented more than a single naval victory. The battle had announced America's emergence as a world power capable of projecting force across the globe's largest ocean. This recognition would shape international relations for decades to come. As traditional powers adjusted to the reality of American global influence, the echoes of the guns that thundered across Manila Bay on May 1st, 1898 would resonate through American history for generations. What had begun as a single naval engagement lasting barely 7 hours had fundamentally altered the trajectory of American foreign policy and established the United States as a Pacific power. The complete destruction of the Spanish fleet marked not just the end of Spanish dominion in the Pacific, but the beginning of what would become known as the American century. In the years following his triumph, Admiral George Dewey became a living symbol of American naval prowess. His image appeared on countless postcards, commemorative plates, and patriotic displays throughout the nation. Cities named streets in his honor, while parents christened their children with his name. The phrase "you may fire when ready" gridly entered American folklore, symbolizing the calm professionalism that had carried the nation to victory. The strategic consequences of Manila Bay extended far beyond the immediate destruction of Spanish sea power. American possession of the Philippines provided a forward base for naval operations throughout the Western Pacific, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the region. Japanese naval planners, studying reports of Dewey's victory, began developing strategies to counter American expansion that would eventually lead to Pearl Harbor 4 decades later. The battle's technological lessons revolutionized naval warfare. Worldwide, Dewey's devastating gunnery had demonstrated the superiority of rapid-fire naval rifles over older, slower-loading cannon. Naval architects in Britain, Germany, and Japan incorporated these lessons into new warship designs, sparking an international arms race that would culminate in the dreadnought battleships of the early 20th century for the Spanish Empire. Manila Bay represented the beginning of the end. The loss of their Pacific fleet made it impossible to defend their remaining overseas territories effectively. Within months, Spanish forces in Cuba and Puerto Rico would also surrender to American arms, bringing 3 centuries of Spanish imperial dominance to a close. The empire that had once claimed half the world now faced complete withdrawal from the FCA, Americas, and the Pacific. The Filipino people found themselves caught between empires as Spanish rule gave way to American administration. While many had initially welcomed Dewey's victory as liberation from Spanish oppression, they soon discovered that American intentions differed little from those of their former colonizers. The Philippine-American War that followed would prove far more costly than the brief conflict with Spain, requiring over 100,000 American troops and lasting 3 bloody years, according to historical analyses compiled by the Naval War College. The Battle of Manila Bay established precedents for American military intervention that would shape foreign policy throughout the 20th century. The swift, decisive victory demonstrated America's ability to project power across vast distances, a capability that would be called upon repeatedly in future conflicts from World War I. Through the Cold War, the personal cost of victory was borne most heavily by Spanish families who lost fathers, sons, and brothers in the burning waters of Manila Bay, while American casualties had been almost negligible. Spanish losses numbered in the hundreds, creating widows and orphans whose suffering was rarely mentioned in American celebrations. The human price of imperial ambition was paid, primarily by those who had never chosen to fight. Admiral Dewey's later career never quite matched the glory of his Manila Bay triumph, though he continued to serve with distinction until his death in 1917. His victory remained the defining moment of his life, the achievement by which history would remember him. The Commodore, who had destroyed a fleet in 7 hours, had helped launch his nation toward global dominance. The Battle of Manila stands as one of history's most consequential naval engagements. Its importance measured not in ships sunk or lives lost, but in the transformation it wrought upon the global balance of power. In those thunderous hours of May 1st, 1898, the United States had announced its arrival as a world power, setting in motion events that would shape the century to come. The guns of Manila Bay had not merely destroyed a Spanish fleet, they had proclaimed the dawn of American empire.